Hi, welcome to this lecture on sensory processing and integration as part of your DIRFloortime 201 certification journey. I'm really grateful and delighted to be able to share with you, and I'm really excited that you're on this journey of exploring more and learning more about DIRFloortime. I'm Virginia Spielmann. I'm a British-trained occupational therapist. I've lived in the UK, Hong Kong, Kenya, and now the USA since 2017. I am the Executive Director of STAR Institute for Sensory Processing, which was founded by Dr. Lucy Jane Miller, based on over 4 decades of work. Dr. Miller has retired now, but I apprenticed under her for a year before taking over as Executive Director shortly after that. STAR Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to see people flourish and engage fully in life through experiencing sensory health and wellness. We want sensory health and wellness for the state, the nation, and the world, and we aim to do this through pioneering best practice treatment for disordered sensory processing, educating therapists and those in other community settings like educational institutions, legal institutions, or every setting you can think of with regards to what sensory processing is and the importance of sensory health and understanding for infant mental health outcomes and more, and research that helps us understand the mechanisms of sensory processing and integration, and again looks at best practice treatments. We will be today learning what sensory processing and integration really is. I hope that you'll be able to explain it to someone else by the time you leave this presentation. It's very much built on the presentation that was in your 101 lecture on sensory processing, and so we've tried very hard not to repeat principles unnecessarily, and really what we're trying to do here is build deeper understanding. We're also going to look here at patterns of disordered sensory processing according to the nosology that Dr. Miller proposed starting in 2007, and you'll hear more about that later. Before we really go into all of those things, of course, it's helpful to think about our own sensory processing. And so I'm not going to read these checklist items out. You can find it on our website. The URL is at the bottom there. But what I want you to do is think about your own sensory processing preferences, because a very important part of DIRFloortime is understanding that your sensory profile and the sensory profile of every individual in the room is different, often profoundly so, and how that would impact the development of an environment of safety and trust and relationships being formed. And so the way that we experience the external world with our external sensory systems and our internal systems of our body, that internal world, is different from person to person and can profoundly impact our function and engagement and the development of those relationships. So a really important piece to think about and reflect on, and perhaps something that you can do with your course facilitators. So let's just remind ourselves what sensory processing and integration refers to. In 1979, Dr. Jean Ayres, the pioneer of the field of sensory integration and processing, she was an occupational therapist and a psychologist and a wonderful neuroscientist. She described it very simply as the organization of sensory input for use. So that sensory data that comes exteroceptively from the world around us, from the people around us, from our environment, all that sensory data that comes in needs to be organized in parallel with the sensory data from our interoceptive systems, our internal systems, about our internal well-being and so on, so that we can respond, so that we can provide responses to what's going on around us. And some of those responses are as simple as staying upright in a chair, and some of them, of course, are much more complicated. We think about an Olympic gymnast and the exquisite sensory motor skills that they display, and that very, very high level sensory integration and processing that's happening there to produce these wonderful routines on the mat and so on. Another way of describing sensory processing and integration is thinking about it's the neural mechanisms. It refers to the neural mechanisms and the behavioral outcomes of how we use what we sense to make sense of the world. And again, another way, and what we're trying to do is find the simplest way to explain this very complex process. And of course, sensory processing and integration should be able to be explained simply, but it's notoriously hard to explain simply. It's hugely simple and it's incredibly complicated. It's the mechanisms of how you feel and how that guides your actions. It's as simple as that. But of course, it's also much more complicated too. Now, hopefully you remember that there are 8 sensory systems, and not just the 5 that we typically learn about. And these 8 systems are very important for us being able to provide that adaptive response. No sensory event, no event is really unisensory. It's very unusual for there to be an event that relies on just one sensory system. And so generally what we're doing all the time is taking pieces of the whole picture from each of these sensory systems and then integrating that information at a brain level so that we can produce a response at a body level. So that's the integration part. And there's the systems of sight, much more complicated than just 20/20 vision, of course. Taste, which is very emotionally loaded, as is smell. Hearing, which tells us where we are in the world as well as what's going on in the world and how fast things are moving, so it gives us information about time. We also have touch, which is a very, very emotional system, helps keep us safe, gives us so much more information than just whether something's rough or smooth. Our vestibular sense, which is that spirit level in our ear, telling us where our head is in relation to the pavement, but also keeping us calm, organizing a lot of the other sensory system information, helping us organize our eyes in space, very importantly, and a big loading factor in keeping us upright, keeping our postures online. We have the proprioceptive system, that system that helps us with our muscles, how fast they should contract or extend, traction and compression on our joints, all that information about force regulation. And then interoception, which is getting an awful lot of attention nowadays, and rightly so, because it's very, very dually loaded with emotional development, as are all of these systems, and tells us a lot about our internal state of well-being. And so we think about interoception as whether or not we are hungry or thirsty, how fast we're breathing, how fast our heart is beating, but it's also very much helping us understand our own emotions, which lays a map for understanding the emotions of others. Of course, all of this is a process. External sensations and internal sensations and interactive experiences are coming together and being made sense of so that we can provide this response to what's going on around us, which we call the adaptive response. That's what we aim for. That's what we want, is an adaptive response. Now, of course, if sensory processing is disordered, the response is going to be maladaptive, which is often called bad behavior. But what we're looking at, aim for here, is the adaptive response. And we talk about that a lot in our AIR sensory integration work, which is the gold standard really for treating disordered sensory processing and a big part of the STAR frame of reference. Sensory integration requires a number of processes to be taking place in all 8 systems all the time. It is something that occurs in every living being. Even plants process sensation. They have a kind of vestibular system, among others. And we modulate sensation, discriminate sensation, and then produce this response, which is often referred to as behavior. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about what this means, but that modulation piece at that neural level, and then the integration and interpretation of that data where sensations are organized and defined, produces these outcomes. Disordered sensory processing can occur at any of these parts of the process and impact engagement, function, participation, and development profoundly. There are multiple models of sensory integration, as you're probably aware. The classic model of sensory integration and typical development was proposed by Ayres in 1979 and republished in 2005. Winnie Dunn has a sensory modulation model about the relationship between our behavioral outcomes and our threshold, the modulation part of sensory processing. And then Suzanne Smith-Rowley and Suzanne Spitzer proposed a model of sensory integration and development. Then there's the analysis of sensory integration functions from 2006. More is coming, more is released all the time, so it won't be long before this slide is out of date, particularly in light of the new evaluations that are all about to be released at the same time, which is very exciting for the field because it means we're going to get a lot more data and we're going to have options as we choose how we want to support our clients and which evaluation we want to use. So there are models of sensory integration that are based on function and how it develops in the neuromajority, and there are also theoretical models of sensory integration dysfunction. And so these are some examples of that. We're going to be speaking from Dr. Miller's nosology from 2007, which has been slightly refined, and I'll refer to that later. And she proposes needs to be further refined as we get this new data coming in. And so there's these references that you can go to. The new Bundy and Lane has been released in 2019, and so really I should update this slide to reflect that. So if you look at the new sensory integration book from Bundy and Lane in 2019, you'll see a really up-to-date model that they're proposing there of sensory integration dysfunction. So as was illustrated before in that process that looked slightly linear, which of course is deceptive because nothing's linear in human development. It's all complex and it's all interrelated, and it tends to be multidimensional too. That we can break this process of sensory integration down and list it in these ways, but again, don't be deceived by how linear this looks. Essentially though, what happens is a sensory stimuli occurs and it's registered and then it's catalogued. It's prioritized. Is this life-threatening or not? How big of a response does this warrant? And then discrimination occurs. And then there's this synthesis of the multisensory information, which we might call integration. So all the pictures are put together. The sensory stimuli is discriminated and then it's all put together so that we can plan our response and produce our response or behavior. And again, I say and then, but really all of this is almost happening simultaneously, and it's not happening just in response to any one stimuli. It's very unlikely, unless you're in a sensory deprivation tank, that you're dealing with one sensory system at a time or one sensory event at a time. Think of all the things going on around you in your environment right now and how many things your brain is processing and dealing with internally and externally. And now think about what that's like in the playground. Sensory processing demands of a dynamic environment like a playground with 20 to 60 other incredibly unpredictable human beings. The sensory processing demands there are exponentially loaded compared to adult learning in a lecture like this. So we have this model of sensory integration processes. This is a functional model of what happens. We have information from the senses that come in at that first level and contribute to some very foundational parts of human function. Sucking responses, the mother-infant bond, muscle tone, being able to be upright against gravity, being able to move our eyes in space. These processes contribute to the development of a body map, body perception, being able to coordinate the two sides of the body, being able to develop a plan, learn how to be attentive to anything, develop emotions and emotional stability. And that leads to the development of slightly higher level functions like producing speech and language, coordinating eye and hand movement, and purposeful activity, which then you have these end product skills. And that would be the ability to concentrate, the ability to organize, develop sense of self, self-esteem, self-control, self-confidence, academic learning. Now, of course, what happens is we often get referred clients, or we often get fixated on end product skills, and we forget to look at these foundational aspects, these client factors that come down, and really what we want to do is encourage a bottom-up as well as a top-down sort of look at human function, and that's the way the STAR frame of reference is set up. But this is the process of sensory integration, if you like, and how it contributes to these things. And I hope you can see that really there's nothing that is wouldn't be able to be classified within this. There's no skill, no area of human domain that isn't supported by this process. And so we can begin to understand how profoundly important it is when it's disordered to provide the right amount of support and to take that into account in any therapy that we're doing. This is not just information for occupational therapists. We need every allied health professional, medical professional, mental health professional, and educator and so on to understand this, because when it goes wrong and is disordered, it needs to have some pretty serious attention paid to it in order to achieve these end product skills which many of our therapies are aimed at. Now, the nosology that Miller proposed in 2007 looks something like this. This is a nosology of sensory processing disorder. And so what this is describing here is significant groups, patterns of sensory disorder that we see over and over again based on data. This is you can group populations perhaps into these subtypes here. It's not about classifying and putting children or adults into a box. It's about understanding patterns so that we can provide the best therapeutic intervention to support the development of sensory integration, which we believe is fundamental to psychological well-being. So there's the three main subtypes: sensory modulation disorder, sensory-based motor disorder, and sensory discrimination disorder, and we're going to talk about those. Under those subtypes are these further groups. And so ideally what you want in your evaluation report from the therapist you've referred a child to perhaps is not just for them to say, yes, sensory processing is obviously a problem here, but let's drill down and look at exactly what's going on for this child. So sensory processing could mean for one child that they're over-responsive to the world around them, and for their neighbor that they're under-responsive. The accommodations and the therapeutic intervention you'll be providing for those children will look very, very different, and it'll be very individualized. And this is why it's important to understand this as much as possible and to work closely with your occupational therapists in, okay, what does that mean for this child? What can I provide for them? These patterns also often co-occur. And so what we mean by that is that a child will have commonly challenges with all three: modulation, discrimination, and posture praxis. Based on this unpublished data from a study some time ago, 23.5% of the group showed challenges in all three, 34.6% challenges in posture and modulation. But you can see a large number of children had challenges in modulation as well, and none of the other two. So just showing that they can overlap, and it's important to look at these. This is just one study, and more work needs to be done on this. But again, we're waiting for these new evaluations to come out. We're really excited about this. One of the things that's been really challenging, I think, is that a lot of our conceptualization of how these patterns fall and these populations present themselves has been very two-dimensional. At STAR, we really like this idea of the autism constellation for explaining neurodivergent differences and how they change over time, and these are 3- and 4-dimensional things that happen. So here you can see sensory modulation, sensory motor challenges, sensory motor capability, and anxiety mapped in a 3-dimensional space. And these challenges are comorbid. They are often experienced by people on the autism spectrum, which is what this came from. That's what the book are about. It's very hypothetical, but you could see that people might be located in every available point in this resulting 3-dimensional space. But we can also start to identify clusters and features that often overlap. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do. And so I show you this because I think it's helpful when you think about, this child falls into this pattern, to realize that there's this interaction between the different subgroups. And also to remember that it can change over time. And so one day where a child might be feeling very capable and from a sensory motor perspective, perhaps the sensory modulation challenges have been really intense that morning, and that will impact them in this other domain as well. Everything's interrelated and connected, and that feels very important to emphasize when we're talking about something in as simplistic terms as we can. We want to make things simple, we want to understand them, but we have to always be mindful that they're complicated. So sensory modulation describes 3 subtypes. The most researched subtype by far is sensory over-responsivity. Sensory under-responsivity comes closely after that. And then the sensory craving group is actually very hypothetical. Sensory over-responsivity is where everything is too big, too fast, too intense. We'll talk about that a bit more later. And then sensory under-responsivity is where you just never quite get enough information to be able to provide that response. Sensory craving, Dr. Miller's current hypothesis about that is very much based on a faulty addiction cycle, faulty reward cycle. But there are other theories around that too. I would say that many of us think that this is a very small percentage of children that come to our centres with disordered sensory processing would be put in this sensory craving group. To the extent that at STAR, for example, if we think we have a true sensory craving child, you know, we'll have a meeting about it. And we've had 2 in 2 years, and I don't think either of them ended up being purely and truly a sensory craving child. We'll talk a tiny bit more about that later. It's very interesting, but because it's so unusual and still so hypothetical, we won't spend too much time on it in this lecture. So sensory modulation occurs at the neural level. It is this difficulty regulating responses to sensory input. And so at a neural level, everything is interpreted in a similar way, perhaps. And therefore responses are disproportionate, right? And so it's the person who jumps when the phone rings as if the fire alarm just went off. Or the child for whom the school bell feels like an attack, like, you know, their ears are being bombarded and their whole nervous system goes into fight or flight. Sensory modulation very much impacts your arousal level, and your fight or flight comes online very easily if you have disordered sensory modulation. So your adaptive response is often maladaptive. You develop atypical behavior patterns, and generally you're seen as a difficult child. But some children with sensory modulation challenges can be seen as a very easy child, easygoing, or oblivious. A very oblivious child doesn't notice anything because they never get the proportionate response, and in fact they're under-responsive to the world around them, for example. Now, when we're talking about sensory modulation, we also are really talking about a contributor to regulation. What it's very important to remember is that regulation is not just sensory. It's not just sensory modulation. Regulation is our ability to be calm, alert, and available. It's very much at a brain level rather than a conscious thinking brain level, upstairs brain level. And many aspects of human function can fill our cup to overflowing so that we become dysregulated or hyper-aroused. Sensory modulation often is a big piece of that, but it's not the only piece. Social stresses, cognitive challenges, emotional stresses, physical stresses, getting too hot, language challenges, being hungry, and so on. You can see sensory loads into a number of these, but sensory modulation is just one bubble that can go into this cup and push it to overflowing. So regulation itself is quite a complex construct that we need to understand as best we can. This self-regulatory process, starts really with basic physiological readiness in response to the world. What we call that homeostasis, and that's the ability to orient to something, ascertain if it's a threat or not, and then habituate to it and no longer orient to it, for example. And so in a new hotel room, we might experience this if you've traveled for this presentation, perhaps, your 201 training, or for a lecture and you're in a hotel. There's going to be different noises. The bed's going to feel different. The air conditioner's going to sound different. There's going to be traffic outside and people in the corridor. And the first night, your sleep's not going to be as good, classically, as the second night when your brain starts to habituate and maintain homeostasis more effectively in this new environment. So you can see there's a lot of sensory going on here. At this very basic level in the first year of life, our job is to learn to maintain regulation. And many of the children we support never quite achieve that in the first year of life, and it's really ongoing for the first 7 years of life. And the better we can support children to regulate themselves and access the co-regulation of others, the more function they're going to have higher up in the FEDCs. And so being able to access soothing from others is part of the self-regulatory process. And then as that develops, it starts to involve more of the brain. And you can imagine that through the lifestyle that, we can start to use our thoughts deliberately, and our thoughts can impact our regulation. And in fact, we can think ourselves into a dysregulated state. It can be nothing to do with the sensory challenges with our environment and so on. And we can also think ourselves back into a regulated state if we become dysregulated and so on. And it helps us develop theory of mind. So there is this sort of process and foundation piece to self-regulation that supports higher level function in a reciprocal manner throughout development. And so self-regulation is not the same as self-control. That comes later. It's much more conscious and cognizant. It's foundational to the development of self-control, self-management, self-governance. Sometimes in the literature, it refers to both, but for the purpose of the STAR frame of reference and for this lecture and so on, we talk about self-regulation as this foundation piece that comes prior to self-management, self-control, and self-governance. And ultimately the development of executive function, those really important skills that we need in order to maintain goal-directed activities over short, mid, and long term. And so higher level learning, fluid reasoning, pattern recognition, and so on, rely on a foundation of self-regulation so that we can develop these skills like working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibition that lead to these higher executive functions. So sensory modulation contributes to regulation. Regulation is hugely important for the development of higher level affective ability, the levels of thinking and cognition. And sensory modulation contributes to this hugely. We need to be regulated in order to function and to achieve what Dr. Miller would call joie de vivre, psychological well-being or flourishing. Eudaimonic well-being is another term that's really helpful here to look up. what we have is we have this arousal curve here for you to see. And so we have the optimal level of arousal where our performance, as you can see here, is maximized and is excellent. And so we need some stress to perform well, and all humans do. And we need to be able to tolerate that stress and utilize that stress in order to perform well. But too much stress and our arousal goes up and our performance goes down, and we're on this kind of roller coaster, up, 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 good performance, and then down, 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 down. In the neuromajority, the window is represented by this gray box where we get acceptable performance, excellent performance up here at the top of the curve, but acceptable performance at home, in behaviors, in function, in engagement, and so on, and academically. Children with disordered sensory processing tend to have a very narrow range in which they can perform of regulatory capacity. And often what we're doing with the child is we're finding that just right range, and we're usually diminishing the challenge in the environment and in the activity until we find that range, and we're entering their world at that stage. We're creating a shared world with them, and then with them at their speed and processing speed, we are expanding that window through fun and play. And we want to make that window as wide as the grey window, as close to the grey window as possible. Not because we want the child to be typical or normal, but because we want them to be able to engage throughout the day as much as possible with joy and with success, and to feel that sense of success. So an important aspect of that work as we try to expand that window of arousal with our children, and we find that just right challenge, we find the sensory input that is going to keep them organized, and we titrate the sensory input that challenges them, and we just add little bits of that at any one time, is that we don't stay in that totally safe and brilliant place all the time. And fun and excitement help us do this, but we add just a little bit. We dance around the edge of the regulatory boundaries of the window of tolerance. And we do that through play, through fun, and we help them keep them regulated through relationship and whichever sensory input has been identified as being organizing for that child. Often, 99% of the time, that's probably proprioceptive input, deep work, high intensity work against resistance, squeezing through small spaces, pushing and pulling, hanging on monkey bars really helps us stay in that middle safe place. And then adding in fun, excitement, pretend play themes, and so on to help us work on that edge and dance in that place that's going to help increase their window of arousal. Okay. Functional regulation looks like shared attention. It looks like a calm, alert, and organized state. So you can be calm and unavailable and oblivious. You're not regulated. And that's something very common. Well, she's very calm. Of course she's regulated. Wait, no, she needs to be calm and available, calm and alert, calm and ready to learn, calm and aware of the world around her. That's what regulation looks like. It looks like a good sleep-wake cycle, cycles of hunger. It looks like the ability to engage in co-regulation, where they're able to access a parent's overtures in order to be calm and even seek them out sometimes. And the development of self-soothing habits like thumb sucking, playing with a cloth, and those sorts of things. That's what functional regulation looks like. So that sensory over-responsive pattern that we started this little bit with, that's like a too small coffee cup. And as soon as you start pouring in the coffee, the cup overflows. And so any sensory stimuli is boom, too big, too bright, too fast, too intense. And so you might be called hyper-reactive or hypersensitive to sensations. And those can be sights, sounds, touch, movement, smells, tastes, so on. You can respond too much but also too frequently, you don't recover. And so you're reacting to everything, and your recovery time is really extended. You don't recover from a fright quickly. In fact, it can knock you off for half an hour. Temper tantrums and meltdowns last for a really long time. And something small like a change in routine can knock you out for the whole day. And so that can look like being aggressive or impulsive, irritable, moody, being upset by transitions and unexpected changes, or avoidance sort of behaviors, avoiding socializing, avoiding difficult things and challenges, especially dynamic places with lots of noise and unpredictability. You can also be excessively cautious, afraid to try new things, and seem like a colicky, fussy, or difficult baby. Sensory under-responsivity, as I said earlier, is where you just need a lot more and a lot longer and a lot, more information. You need more intensity before you can provide that adaptive response. So your cup is huge and it's empty and it needs to be completely full before you know, oh, there's something going on around me that I need to respond to. Sometimes we think a sensory under-responsive child is a sensory avoider. And that's why it's really important to really get an in-depth evaluation, because a child who is in their own world and in their own space very well could be doing that as a strategy to minimize the environment around them. Or could it be, if we think about these possible alternative diagnoses, could it be that the child needs more from the people around them? I'm here. I'm the most interesting thing in the world. They get enough information and they can provide that response. And so we really have to be detectives and use all the tools available to us to build these hypotheses. And then remember that we're always evaluating and refining our hypotheses. So sensory under-responsivity, is this decreased awareness. You might be called hypo-responsive to sensation. You might appear lethargic, passive, difficult to engage, ignore your name being called, easily lost, self-absorbed, easily exhausted, excessively slow to respond to directions, lazy, uninterested, poor inner drive. That's what that might look like. So let's quickly talk about sensory craving. This is considered very rare, as I said earlier. That's important to know. It's hypothesized to be similar to a faulty reward cycle. So there's never enough. And as soon as we get the behavior we're seeking, our brain tells us we need more. We need another hit. We need a more intense hit. And so indulging in the sensory activities doesn't organize or regulate the child better. So there's a child here. Most children, if you find the right sensory input, will become more organized and available for learning. The child with sensory craving, it doesn't matter what sensory input you give them, they keep ramping up, and they don't become more available, more organized as a result of the sensory input. And so there's a very different way of approaching that. Generally, you provide a lot of structure, things with a beginning and a middle and an end, and you help them move on to the next thing. And it's really much easier to support these children when the frontal lobe starts to come online as they get a bit older. But again, this is very unusual. Often people will come to us saying, I think 70% of my sensory craving, of my caseload is sensory craving when they come to mentorships at STAR and so on, and they'll leave going, okay, no, I can unpack this more, and we can figure out what's going on with these kids and how to help them get more organized. So it's not the same as behaviors that are sensory seeking. That's describing behaviors and a response to your sensory input. Sensory craving is describing this faulty reward cycle when nothing is ever good enough. Okay, a sensory seeking behavior might be, I need to chew to feel better. Does it help you feel better? Okay, then you're not a sensory craver. I hope that makes sense. And so the brain tricks the individual to feel that obtaining the stimulus is what they need, but it actually pushes them into greater hyperarousal. So the stimulation needs to be interrupted with the beginning, the middle, and the end. We do games that are stop and go. We're not trying to fill their cup because the cup has a hole in it. Or they're going to need the next type. They're going to need the next type of coffee. They're going to want the Frappuccino after you give them the espresso, those sorts of things, okay? These are the sort of behaviors we expect in children who fit this subtype. As you'll see, also very similar to trauma behaviors. And so there's a lot of thinking around that at the moment as well. Okay, we need to be able to discriminate sensation to produce an adaptive response to sensation. Okay, and so we have to understand and interpret incoming sensory messages. And so I need to be able to hear a sound, tell, first of all, whether I'm in danger or not, but then also where in the world the sound is coming from. Is it approaching me or not? Does it have any temporal qualities? What is the sound? Is it a machine? Is it organic? What rhythm does the sound have? All these sorts of things tell me if someone's approaching me, if I'm approaching someone, those sorts of things. Discrimination, it really is important for us to feel regulated, however. And so you can see that regulation is not just about sensory modulation. And two examples I can think of with that, one is about the visual vestibular system. When you're sitting on public transport, on a bus, for example, and there's another bus next to you, and suddenly you can't tell which one of you is moving, your brain goes into hyperarousal very quickly because you can no longer discriminate what's happening in your environment. When we cannot discriminate what's happening in our environment, the brain naturally thinks we're in danger or we're at greater risk, and therefore we go into a slightly more hypervigilant state. We go into this hypervigilant state as the buses the movement disagrees with what our visual system is telling us. The vestibular system and the visual system get into a tussle. We go into hypervigilance. We look around us. We get more information. We maybe talk to someone. We feel better. We recover. Okay? Unless we have this discrimination problem all the time, which will affect our recovery time as well. But discrimination can load into regulation. Okay? That interpretation of subtle details to figure out what's going on in the world around us. Another example is in the elevator going up and down, when suddenly you can't tell if it's moving anymore or which direction it's moving in. Again, your nervous system goes into hyperarousal, becomes more vigilant because you need to figure out what's going on because you need to figure out if you're safe or not. And so discrimination can load into our sense of safety and put us into a fight or flight state if it's gone awry. We're going to watch this video of this very young child now and just look at all the discrimination that's happening here. This is a child with exquisite sensory integration and processing skill and ability.
You got that. Let's get it. This is my kind of rail right here. Yeah. Actually, you should probably get in on that. You should get on it. Oh, yes! Well, you got me on the trick. It's true.
Okay, and I mean, ideally, I think what I'd like you to do is pause the video now and in your groups discuss all the different discrimination that you saw in the different sensory systems there. It's much more interesting than listening to me talk about it. But in case you can't do that, there's beautiful visual discrimination happening here, spatial relationships, how fast his body is going as he gets optic flow and the world is moving around him, people moving around him too. So he's learning about speed, time, spatial relationships. He's using sounds. There's lots of sounds in his environment, but there's also the sound of his body on the board and the skateboard on the ground. So he's got this dynamic piece of equipment between his body and the ground, which he's also timing himself around beautifully. His postural responses to what's happening and his writing reactions are just gorgeous. So lots of vestibular processing happening. So vestibular, visual, auditory. He's touching the ground regularly. He's touching his board. He's feeling those surfaces. He's climbing up. He's getting lots of body scheme information, lots of proprioceptive and tactile information, and so on. And just lovely, as well as the social engagement of the relationship there that's helping keep him motivated to keep trying this really difficult task, which he, of course, is incredibly good at. So he's using a lot of really exquisite sensory discrimination that's really far beyond his developmental age, and some people never achieve that level. So when we have challenges with sensory discrimination patterns, we might not be able to differentiate or discern the difference between sensory stimuli. And so tones of voice might all seem the same to us. Or they might all seem threatening to us. And of course, you can imagine how that impacts the development of relationships and emotional development. Facial expressions could be overwhelming and impossible to differentiate what that means. That visual information, we don't discriminate it. And so we don't know if someone is angry with us or happy with us. We might not know how hard we were touched or if we're being touched at all. And so touch, that incredibly important sensory stimulus for developing relationship with our caregivers, might in fact be confusing and overwhelming. And so if I don't know where I'm being touched, or if I'm being touched with good intent or bad intent, then I might remove myself from all touch simply because it's confusing. Not necessarily because it's painful or uncomfortable, but because it's confusing and I don't know what to do with that information. That's the sensory discrimination part. It's too much, it's overwhelming, it's painful, it's uncomfortable. That's sensory modulation. We might not be able to differentiate similar stimuli from one another. So dog and bog, those sorts of words might be confusing. Letters might be confusing very, very commonly. We might not be able to differentiate what's in a messy drawer and take things out and so on accurately. And we need all of those underlying pieces to help us produce these adaptive responses, which are motor in nature in the first place very, very commonly. And so we talk about praxis and then dyspraxia when praxis is disordered. And we talk about postural disorder. And so dyspraxia is also sometimes called developmental coordination disorder, and that is complicated and can be difficult at any of these in these aspects. So ideation, the sequencing and planning part, and the motor output part, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then postural disorder, which is incredibly common and massively undiagnosed and unnoticed. We are creating postural disorders in the neuromajority at the moment with our lifestyles, but also if we have sensory, if we have disordered sensory processing, posture is even more challenging for us nowadays because we're moving less, we're being seated in baby equipment that doesn't promote the development of posture, and so that the impact of our current lifestyles on a vulnerable nervous system for posture is pretty dire at the moment, and so it's something that really requires a lot of attention to be paid to it. So sensory-based motor disorders are often seen in children who have challenges with proprioception, vestibular, also tactile and visual senses, those senses that allow our bodies to move and sense position. And so we're just going to talk about those. Now, posture is the ability to stay upright against gravity, and it should be finessed. It shouldn't be rigid. It's not about being an immovable structure. It's about being a dynamic, responsive structure according to the environment and task demands, being able to rotate our trunks and so on. So posture, we're going to talk about a little bit more, and then that dyspraxia we're coming to in a minute comes under this sensory-based motor disorder subtype. So posture involves controlling the body's position in space for the dual purpose of stability and orientation. So it is dynamic in nature. We must be able to orient to what's happening. We must be able to have anticipatory postures, so be ready for movement. Posture requires being ready for movement as well as being upright and being stable. So we can be stacked on our spine and in our furniture. We can be upright, and you'll hear parents and educators and so on say, but he has a great posture. He's always sitting up in his chair. He's never lying on the ground. But there are multiple ways I can be stacked and upright without having functional, healthy core recruitment that enables me to have a dynamic response to my environment and orient to things in my environment. So we need to change the way we talk about posture a little bit and move from talking about core strength and sit-ups and those sorts of things towards a much more dynamic understanding of orientation, stability, and core recruitment. There are lots of muscles involved in posture, much more than just the stomach muscles, and there are all of these aspects of that contribute to postural control. So what's available in the environment, especially for the younger children or children with more immature posture, contributes to postural control. Our motor, sensory, and cognitive ability, there is a cognitive component to posture, contributes to postural control. This is really talking about balance here. And then our regulation, our state of readiness, and the tasks that we're being presented with. What are they? So we need to think about posture. Again, I come back to this idea that it's not just a unitary construct, as with everything I've said so far, but it's complex and there's all these pieces that interact. And so the contributors to posture include regulation, alignment, biomechanical alignment, muscle tone, underlying tone, and we can't change underlying tone, but we can change muscle fitness, and we can use a sensory lifestyle to help the muscles activate more readily. If the sensory lifestyle gets put to the side, the muscle tone will return to its baseline state. The ability to maintain that anti-gravity posture, our movement strategies, our sensory integration, these all contribute to steady state balance, which is really what we want. And you can see all these different postures in that line of children there, and how different their steady states are. And of course, as you get bored, if we think about regulation and arousal, that impacts your posture, and you might curve your spine more and switch off, or you might let your belly go out and kind of lean back if you're younger. Your emotional state also impacts your posture. Depression, excitement, and so on impact your posture. We do need to pay attention to alignment when we're working on posture. We want optimal alignment between the pelvis and the ribs. We want nice respiration, and so on. And so that's that steady state balance. But we also want reactive balance in our young people to develop. And so that's that ability to shift according to what's going on. So it's got a much higher sensory integration load. There's more visual information coming in to help us change our balance according to what's needed. We use ankle and hip strategies and so on. You can imagine that as you look at this baby getting information from dad as he moves and tries to keep his arms stable, but it's unlikely that it's totally stable. We also want anticipatory balance for our children. So this is a higher level again. And so that's that ability to see something is coming, and I need to shift, I need to move. or I'm about to go and I'm going to be ready with my posture and my respiratory system to go. It's that readiness to go, readiness for action. And so that requires many attributes as well. And all of this can be found in Shumway, Cook and Wollacott book. And so postural disorder often is described as laziness, weakness, tiring easily fatigued, gives up easily when challenged physically, avoids physical challenges, physical endurance is compromised, but also can massively impact oculomotor control and oral motor control. And so if that's what you're seeing in your child, I really would have a closer look at posture and what's going on there. So postural control is impacted by so many systems that, and we really want to be taking a closer look at from a sensory integration perspective, these systems and how they work together. So are we aligned biomechanically? Are our muscles our friend? Do we have flexion? Do we have flexion and extension? Are we using information from our sensory systems, organizing it to help us produce this outcome? Are there cognitive strategies that can help if that's age appropriate, and so on? And do we have those cognitive resources? Sometimes what happens when posture requires all of our attention is that higher level cognitive resources are simply not available. It's like an app on an iPhone that drains all the battery and there's no battery available for anything else. And so we wonder why this child's never learning. But the truth is we're asking them to stay upright against gravity in a static posture for 35 minutes. And that's what's taking all of their neural resources. And so they're not available for learning. And so what we want to really understand is that praxis, let's talk about praxis, sorry, so that's the next subtype, sensory-based motor pattern here. And this is very neurocognitive. So there's a sensory motor piece and there's a huge cognitive piece to this because it is cognition that directs motor action. Praxis really is a goal-directed motor response to the environment or to the activity, but very much based on sensory information from the body and the environment. We talk about praxis mostly in novel situations, so where the response is to something unfamiliar, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. It's very much related to the performance of everyday occupation and very much requires us to be regulated in the first place and to be able to discriminate sensation in order to produce those praxis responses. Okay, but before we develop praxis, before we develop an idea of movement, we really need to be able to know what's available to us in our environment. And so we need to understand about affordances. So what an affordance is it's really not a conscious process of understanding that objects and events have inherent values. And so children teach us about affordances when they see a cardboard box. Because a cardboard box to a grown-up is generally a storage receptacle. It is an item that we use to put things in and maybe make a Halloween costume from if we're really creative. But to a child, a cardboard box is drivable, it's sittable, it's buildable, it's hideable, it's a place to live, it's a place to squeeze, it's a place for dark, it's a place for movement, and all sorts of things. Affordances is when we see something in the environment and we see all the things that we could do with it, all the opportunities that it offers. That's what leads to action possibilities. That's what leads to ideation. And some of our children are stuck on affordances. They see a cardboard box and they've got no concept of what it offers to them. Think of a chair. A chair is another example. So when an adult sees a chair or someone with lower ideation, and ideation poor affordances diminish as we get older, we know this. So an adult generally sees a chair and sees something that's sittable. A child sees something that's flyable, that's hideable, that's jumpable, that's danceable, that's rowable, drivable, and so on. I think I already said that. But they see all these affordances of the chair, especially a chair on wheels, especially a chair that spins. Suddenly the affordances go out the window, and they want to do so much more with what they can see than an adult. But other children are stuck, and they see a chair and they don't even know that it's sittable. And they just see a curious item, and they don't understand the affordances offered to them. In affordance theory, the organism and its environment complement each other, and you know, they're inseparable. They interact with each other, and so we see the environment, and we see what it offers us, and there's this relationship with the environment. It's a playable environment. There's all these things that we can do in the environment, and that's one reason why there's a lot of merit to working with a child in the home, in their natural environment, rather than in isolation in a room that's boring, because the organism environment interaction should be organic, dynamic, and flowing. And so affordance is almost a box that comes before ideation in this praxis picture here. Affordance is, if we were thinking in a linear way, which we're always very careful to say, be cautious about, we would put affordances before ideation on this diagram. This diagram is from Theresa May Benson, and it's this idea of how ideation leads to execution of motor output. Describes praxis as this ability to conceive of, have an idea, organize, and carry out a sequence of unfamiliar actions again. So what we're saying is we can practice and practice a motor task until it becomes habitual, and then that's no longer involving praxis. Okay, so a high praxis task is learning to drive. Once you've learnt to drive and it becomes automatic, it's no longer a high praxis task unless you're very stressed, you're driving in a different situation, you're a British person learning to drive in America, for example. All that praxis had to come back. And oh boy, did I find that stressful. Here's that picture, slightly easier to see, and you can see the concept of praxis at a very basic level here, and the visual of many of the aspects that are involved. So at any of these stages, there can be something that goes awry that would lead to a challenge with praxis. Motor planning and sequencing is a component of praxis here. It's not everything. It's not all the things, and it's what creates the ability for a person, I'm pointing at the screen and I should be using my mouse, to execute the idea. The idea must be initiated, planned, and sequenced, and then as I execute the plan, I respond to the feedback I get about how successful it is, and I adjust my plan accordingly. And some of our children, they don't adjust the plan. They do the same thing again and again and again, and they're unsuccessful in the same way again and again and again and again. And those praxis challenges might need some support. We might need to say to that child, I think we need to change our plan. I'm noticing that didn't work the last 5 times. I wonder what we can do differently, and those sorts of things. Motor ideation generally comes online before creative ideation, which comes online at those higher FEDCs. So motor ideation often is coming online at FEDC 3. We're really learning physical cause and effect, and if I do this, then this happens. If I do this, then this happens. If I move my arm differently, then this happens. And that's really important because it's like a precursor to creative ideation later, and also to the understanding social cause and effect and that sense of agency. So praxis is this idea of creating an action based on will, having an intent, and creating an action. And so I intend to do something, I make a plan, the thing I intended happens. We all know what it's like when our intent and our action are in disagreement with each other. So a perfect example of it at the moment is that show on Netflix, which is called Nailed It, right? I intend to make a great cake or make a great craft, but it comes out looking nothing like the idea in my head or the picture on Pinterest. My intent and my action did not marry. I organized a plan, I executed the plan, and it was horribly disappointing. Now take that to a very basic level, right? I want to hit the ball. I want to hit the mobile above my head. I want to play with dad. I want to move my toy. I want to feed myself. It comes out horribly wrong every single time because my intent and my action can never marry with each other. And so that has huge impacts on the development of regulation, the development of attention, the development of relationships, and higher level academic skills, and especially sense of self. And so really important to think about that impact there. Okay, now I said that it's both a sensory motor and a cognitive skill, and I'm going to show you this horribly overwhelming picture to try and illustrate that really all I'm doing by showing you this picture is trying to demonstrate that it's a whole brain praxis, and that's really all you need to remember from this. We start from the middle in this picture, the initiation of goal determination, so those intentional processes in response to stimuli. Okay, something needs to happen. And there's a conscious awareness of a need for goal-directed action. And then the whole brain is involved in coming up with an idea. And part of what's involved is previous knowledge of actions and object functions. Right? Now, again, if I've had poor praxis from minute one of life outside the womb, my database of previous actions and object functions is going to be in disarray. It's going to be chaotic and unhelpful and disorganized. And so I don't have a map to draw from. I don't have a data bank to draw from. Right? And so sometimes an occupational therapist's job is to help a child build that database so that they can then build more advanced praxis responses to the world around them, right? I need to be able to create a motor image of the desired goal that I want. Now, sometimes an occupational therapist is slowing a child down because they never really learned to make that motor image, and they need to start, that needs to be involved in their process. So sort of visualizing what we're doing and then creating a potential action sequence. So what is going to happen here? And we want that to be based on previous experience. And in more mature praxis, we want it to be based on predictive ability of what the world is going to be like. So again, that database is hugely important. And then I need to make the plan. I need to organize the plan into a specific sequence of actions. I need to know how my limbs and body are going to work together so that I can accomplish this intended goal. I need to motor program the specific limb and how I'm going to rotate my forearm and extend my wrist. There's so much going on here. And it's very conscious in the initial stages of learning a motor task. Remember learning to drive, how conscious you were. You said things out loud. You really thought about what you were doing. And now you know where to find things. But when you get in a new car, it becomes more conscious again, doesn't it? As you map the car, create that data bank, and develop the motor skill, develop the program that you're going to execute. Okay? So again, just the complexity of praxis here. This is from Suzanne Smith-Rowley. Her acknowledgement has just slipped off the screen a little bit there, but hopefully you can still see it. I think it's very important to cite our sources for all these different things. But there's so much that goes on in praxis. It does require a high degree of expertise to support dyspraxic kiddos to be successful. Most important, I think, for you to understand at the 201 level is that it impacts our ability to interact with people hugely and the development of social skills hugely. Okay, our ability to be successful in the environment, to develop sense of self, but also to interact with people is impacted by praxis and supported by praxis or derailed by praxis a great deal. And it's going to impact pretend play hugely. We're not going to develop symbolic capacities, not likely, if we have great challenges with praxis. Now, we know that we can, because children in wheelchairs can develop symbolic capacity, but it's very different the way that it happens. Okay, so what does dyspraxia look like? Well, delays in attaining motor milestones, difficulty with learning new motor skills, difficulty with multi-step tasks, taking a really long time to learn routines. And you're going to develop maladaptive behaviors because you're going to want to avoid all these things. Some of our dyspraxic kids, many of them, have really good strategies for avoiding the things that are hard. They become really good delegators. They become really bossy. They look like they're refusing to do something because they're haughty or they're snooty or they're difficult. In middle school, it starts to really show in that difficulty keeping the locker organized, the backpack organized, those sorts of things. Problem solving can be really hard, and emotional dysregulation can be a big part of the dyspraxic presentation. Okay, a lot of people who have challenges with praxis prefer talking to doing. They'd much rather talk about the game than play the game. They'd much rather talk about the imaginary location that you're playing in than build it with soft play toys and so on. And they might also frequently break objects because they don't understand the affordances of the objects they're playing with. Okay, now similar to what we looked at earlier from Suzanne Smith-Rowley, which showed these sort of levels of sensory integration, here's another way of visualizing that. Again, it's only two-dimensional, so it's limited, but there is no perfect model of human function. This is another way of looking at how sensory processing supports flourishing, supports psychological well-being, or joie de vivre. You have this foundation piece of arousal, the importance of relationships and engagement, and then you have these sensory motor processes. So interpreting information from the sensory system information coming in and being registered, right? Do you remember that sort of linear relationship I outlined before? And then that ability to modulate, filter, and pay attention to the appropriate sensory stimuli to the appropriate degree. And then you can see as levels go higher what's going on here. Now, I just want to take a minute to point out that primitive reflexes don't appear in this pyramid. Primitive reflexes can't be put in their own block because we actually never fully integrate our primitive reflexes. If you look at Olympic sportsmen and women, pushing them to the very edge of their ability, you will be able to see most commonly the ATNR reflex, for example. And what that means when we see them demonstrating that reflex is that they are pushing themselves past their limit. Children who demonstrate the reflex regularly, who do not have a brain difference like cerebral palsy, and nothing that would show up on an MRI to that degree, are often most likely to be having challenges with posture and sensory integration at a more global level. And so primitive reflexes can be addressed as part of a broader program very successfully, but they're not generally the thing that's going to fix all these other systems and sensory integration dysfunction as a whole. They need to be considered as part of that systems theory approach. That's why they're not in there. It's a question that comes up sometimes. What you can see is the purple layers at the very top are those end-level skills. And so social participation, learning, regulated interactions, social confidence, and self-esteem. And they come much higher. Now, this pyramid reflects the structures and the architecture of the brain. The upstairs brain takes up a lot more real estate than the mid and the lower brain. But the mid and the lower brain, these smaller areas, are the foundation for these higher level skills. And so when we flip our lid and go limbic or get emotional, when we have challenges in the mid and the lower brain, it can derail learning in these higher areas. And so there's another reason, and here's perhaps a tool that you can use to explain to parents why you're going where you're going in your therapy, and also how play supports integration. I hope that's been woven through this, and I'm sure you're talking about it all the way through your DIR 201 course, so that we can achieve these higher levels that might have been the target skill, the presenting problem that the parents or the caregivers or the school came into therapy with. So each of these 8 sensory systems, in summary, has sensory affective properties and functions, supports the development of sense of self hugely, the ability to form relationships, the ability to develop symbolic thinking, and so on. We make meaning of ourselves, of the world around us, and of our relationships, really from this sensory motor perspective. And in infancy, facial expressions are affective and sensory motor entirely. Touch can't be separated out into physical or emotional. It's absolutely both. We share and mirror the actions of caregivers, that's motor skills, and then learn the meanings of others. We learn about our emotions, and then we are able to map other people's emotions, and we're able to learn about theory of mind. And I hope that this really sort of broadens your mind in that area, and that begins your wider journey of how sensory processing supports human development through the lifespan. There's more reading here that I think you'll find really helpful. And I look forward to hearing from you about how you found this lecture and crossing paths with you in the DIR floor time world.